The silver did not belong to her. Neither did the house. Neither did the grounds, the carriages, the 12 bedrooms, the library with its 2,000 books, or the rose garden that bloomed every June without being asked. None of it belonged to her. This was a fact Sarah Voss had known since the morning she arrived at Dunmore Hall with a single trunk and a letter of recommendation, and the quiet, settled understanding of a woman who had learned very young that the world was divided into people who owned things and people who cleaned them. She had been cleaning them for 2 years. She had been cleaning them without knowing that her name was on the deed. Before we go any further, if this is your first story with us, welcome to the Duke Obsession. Every week we bring you stories of hidden rooms, forgotten names, and the moment a woman discovers that everything she was told about herself was wrong. Subscribe now and turn on the notification bell. Now, back to the silver. Sarah Voss was 23 years old and had been, since the age of 15, entirely alone in the world. Her mother, Clara Voss, had died in the spring of Sarah's 15th year, quietly in the small rented room they shared above a laundry in the village of Pemlick, with the particular dignity of a woman who had spent 20 years keeping her pride intact despite everything that had tried to take it from her. Clara had never spoken about her family, not once. In 15 years of questions, the curious questions of a small child, the pressing questions of an older one, she had given the same answer every time, delivered with the same gentle, immovable finality. "There is no family," she would say. "There is only us." After she died, Sarah had found in the box beneath the floorboards that she had not known existed until she was packing the room 3 things: a pressed violet, faded to gray, a letter unfinished addressed to no one that said only, "I know what I gave up. I do not regret it, but I want her to know some day that she came from something worth knowing," and a locket. The locket was silver, old, engraved on the back with a crest Sarah did not recognize, a rose and a single letter beneath it, ornate and worn smooth with handling, the letter V. She had worn the locket every day since. She had never known what it meant. She had carried it the way you carry things you do not understand but cannot bring yourself to put down, with the persistent, faithful hope that someday the meaning would arrive. It had not arrived. Not yet. Dunmore Hall was the seat of the Duke of Dunmore, and it sat in the Wiltshire countryside like a man who had been there so long he had become indistinguishable from the landscape itself. Its stone was the gray of old clouds. Its windows were tall and narrow, designed in the century before the one that valued light, so the rooms inside were always slightly dimmer than seemed right, as though the house preferred to keep its own counsel about what it contained. The grounds stretched for 300 acres in every direction, farms, woodland, a lake that went perfectly still in winter and perfectly silver in summer, and all of it was tended with the kind of quiet, unhurried care that spoke of a house that had been managed well for a long time. Sarah had come here 2 years ago, answering an advertisement for a downstairs housemaid, and had been interviewed by the housekeeper, Mrs. Aldridge, a tall woman with silver hair and the particular quality of stillness that belonged to people who had spent decades managing large households and long since been surprised by anything they found in them. Mrs. Aldridge had looked at Sarah's letter of recommendation, then at Sarah, then back at the letter, with an expression Sarah had not known how to read at the time. She had thought it was assessment. She had been wrong. "Can you be discreet?" Mrs. Aldridge had asked. "Yes, ma'am." "Can you work without asking questions?" "Yes, ma'am."
Good. Mrs. Aldridge had folded the letter. "You will clean the rooms assigned to you. You will not enter the east wing without my explicit permission. You will not open closed doors. You will not linger in the portrait gallery." She had paused. "You will begin Monday." Sarah had begun Monday. She had not thought anything of the rules. Every great house had its rules. She had followed them for 2 years without deviation, until the morning in February when a frozen pipe burst in the servants' corridor and the water that flooded the East Wing passage took with it 3 storage boxes that had been stacked against the East Wing door for as long as any member of staff could remember. And the East Wing door, no longer blocked, swung open, and Sarah, arriving to assess the damage before Mrs. Aldridge could be found, had stepped inside. The East Wing had not been used in years. She could feel it the moment she crossed the threshold, the particular quality of air in rooms that have been closed for a long time, still and slightly sweet, like the inside of a book that has not been opened. The corridor beyond the door was dim, the lamps unlit. The carpet runner muffled her footsteps so completely she felt like she was moving through something suspended. She told herself she was checking for water damage. This was true. She told herself she would go no farther than the first room. This was not. Because at the end of the East Wing corridor, through the open door of what appeared to be a small sitting room, she could see a painting. It was large, larger than the portraits in the main gallery, which were formal and measured and hung with the self-important precision of paintings that knew their own value. This one had been hung at the end of the corridor, as though placed there for someone specific, as though it was not for display, as though it was for finding. Sarah walked toward it. The painting was of a young woman, perhaps 20, perhaps younger, standing in a garden Sarah did not recognize, wearing a pale dress the color of early morning. Her hair was dark, pinned simply, with a few strands loose at her neck. Her expression was the expression of someone who had just finished laughing and had not yet composed herself into the look she wore for the world. She was beautiful in the way that real people are beautiful, not arranged, not curated, but alive in a way that oil and canvas should not have been capable of capturing, and somehow had. Sarah had stood 5 feet from that painting for 30 seconds before her legs stopped working. She knew the face, not from the portraits in the main gallery, not from any painting she had ever seen in any house she had ever worked in. She knew it the way you know a thing that lives inside you rather than outside, instinctively, physically, the knowledge rising from somewhere below thought. It was her mother's face, Clara Voss, dead 8 years, 20 years younger than Sarah had ever known her, standing in a garden that did not belong to a woman who rented rooms above a laundry in Pembroke, wearing a dress that cost more than Clara had earned in a year. Laughing. Sarah's hand went to the locket at her throat without her deciding to move it. She turned the painting over with hands that were not entirely steady. On the back, written in ink that had faded to the color of old rust, were 4 words: "My Clara, always mine." Below it, a date: 24 years ago, the year before Sarah was born. She did not tell anyone what she had found. She repaired the East Wing door. The flooding had been minimal, the damage less than feared, and she went back to her duties, and she said nothing. Not to Polly, the kitchen maid she shared a room with, not to Thomas, the footman, who noticed everything and said most of it aloud, not to Mrs. Aldridge, who she understood, thinking back to the interview, had known something on the very first morning. She said nothing because she had learned, growing up the daughter of a woman who kept secrets like other people kept furniture, essential, permanent, the very structure of the rooms she lived in, that some things needed to be understood before they were spoken. She was not ready to speak.
She went back to the East Wing on Thursday, and Friday, and the following Monday. Each time she stood in front of her mother's portrait and looked at the painted face of a woman she had known for 15 years and apparently not known at all. Each time she noticed something new. The garden in the background. She had studied it now closely enough to see the specific rows climbing the south wall, deep crimson, distinctive. She had seen that rose somewhere, in the living grounds of this estate. On the south wall of the walled garden she passed every morning on her way to the kitchen. The dress, pale, expensive, with a specific embroidered border that she had seen before, too, not in the portrait gallery. On the mannequin in the storage room off the main corridor, in the box labeled simply C, which she had passed 100 times without opening. And the locket, she had looked closely enough now to see it in the portrait, worn at her mother's throat, silver, old, with an engraved back. The same locket Sarah wore every day. Her mother had not taken it with her when she left. She had painted it into the record, so it would exist somewhere, permanent, in a house she could not return to. On the fourth visit, Sarah found the letter. It was tucked behind the painting's frame, folded small, sealed with wax the color of dried roses, and addressed in a handwriting she did not know. For whoever finds this, when the time is right. She broke the seal. It was written in 2 hands. The first, careful, feminine, the handwriting of someone who had learned to write beautifully before they had been given any reason to write urgently. It said, "If you are reading this and you are not her, please find her. She will have dark hair, amber eyes, and a locket she does not understand. She will have grown up without knowing where she came from. She will have been told, because I told her mother to tell her, that there was no family, because I believed at the time that this was the kindest thing. I no longer believe it. I am too old and too tired of kindness that costs other people everything." She is the granddaughter of the 3rd Duke of Dunmore. Her mother, Clara Vane, was my daughter. What happened to Clara was my failure and my shame, and I will not dress it in polite language. She loved someone the family did not approve of. I made the choice that parents of our position make when they are more afraid of society than they are of their own children's grief. I sent her away with a new name and a small sum and the absolute requirement of silence. I have regretted it every day since. The second hand was different, older, shakier, written years later in ink that had run slightly where a drop of something had fallen on the page. It said, "She never came back. I looked for her for 20 years, and I found her grave in Pemwick, and I found a record of a daughter she had raised alone, and I commissioned this portrait from a miniature her landlady had kept, the only image of her that existed. And I had it painted large so she would not be small in this house the way she was made small in life. If the daughter reads this, Sarah, her name was Sarah, she always meant to tell you. Your mother loved you more than the family that took everything else from her. This house is yours. It was always yours. I left the provision in the will. I only hope someone gives you this letter before the lawyers do." It was signed Eliza Vane, Dowager Duchess of Dunmore. Dated 3 years ago, 1 year before Sarah had arrived at Dunmore Hall answering an advertisement for a housemaid. Sarah sat on the floor of the East Wing sitting room for a long time. The portrait looked down at her. Her mother laughed silently above her, caught in the moment before composure, held there forever in crimson and pale morning light. She thought about Mrs. Aldrich, the look in the interview, the extra pause before she folded the letter. "You will not linger in the portrait gallery. Do not enter the East Wing." Rules that had kept her from finding this for 2 years. She thought about the advertisement she had answered, a downstairs housemaid position at a great estate in Wiltshire. She had found it in a notice board at the employment office in the town nearest to Pemwick, where she had gone after her previous position ended and she had needed work quickly. She thought about how specific the advertisement had been. Must have previous household experience, must be willing to reside on property, must be available immediately.
She thought about how, of the women who had applied, she had been called for interview the same day. She thought about a dowager duchess who had found her mother's grave and commissioned a portrait and hidden a letter and written a provision into a will and then died before she could do the one remaining thing, tell someone to find her. Or perhaps she had told someone. Sarah got up off the floor. She walked down the east wing corridor, through the door, along the servants' passage, and knocked on Mrs. Aldridge's office door. "Come." She opened the door. She said, without preamble, without performance, in the voice of a woman who had spent 23 years not knowing who she was and had decided in the last 20 minutes that she was finished not knowing. "You placed the advertisement." Mrs. Aldridge looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, "Sit down, Sarah." It was the first time she had used her name. She had worked at Dunmore Hall for 30 years. She had been here when Clara Vane was sent away. She had watched the Dowager Duchess spend 20 years searching, 20 years of grief so contained it looked like composure to everyone who did not know what they were looking at. She had been the one to find Clara's grave. She had traveled to Pemwick herself on the Dowager's behalf and had found the record of a daughter, name, age, last known employment. The Dowager had died 3 months later. She had not been able to arrange everything before the end. But she had done 2 things. She had changed her will. The provision was there, filed with the estate's solicitor, waiting. And she had told Mrs. Aldridge where to look and what to do when she found her. "I placed the advertisement," Mrs. Aldridge said. "I worded it precisely so only someone with your specific history, your age, your experience, your location would be likely to answer it. I was not certain it would work." She paused. "It worked in 3 weeks." Sarah said, "You knew from the day I arrived?" "The moment I saw your face. You have your grandmother's eyes." Mrs. Aldridge said it plainly, the way she said everything. "And your mother's way of looking at things directly, as though you were deciding something." Sarah said, "Why did you not tell me?" Mrs. Aldridge said, "Because Her Grace asked me not to. She believed that the truth needed to arrive on your terms. She had taken every other choice from your mother. She did not want to take that one from you." She said, "The east wing door. I may have been less than completely rigorous about ensuring those boxes remained stable," Mrs. Aldridge said, with the precision of a woman who had spent 30 years maintaining a single distinction between what she did and why she did it. Sarah looked at her. Mrs. Aldridge met her eyes without flinching. She said, "I thought you were ready. If this story has you completely in your grip right now, you are exactly where we want you. Subscribe to the Duke Obsession before you go any further. Every week, a brand new story. Hidden rooms, forgotten daughters, and the moment a woman finds out who she always was. Turn on notifications. Now, back to Sarah. The Duke of Dunmore was named Crispin Vane. He was 30 years old, the grandson of the 4th Duke, which made him, Sarah understood, sitting in Mrs. Aldridge's office after she left with the letter in her hand and her mother's face burned into the inside of her eyelids, her second cousin. She had served his breakfast for 2 years. She had poured his coffee at 7 in the morning, set his fire at 6, carried his correspondence from the hall table to his desk without ever once being acknowledged as a person rather than a function. She did not know how she felt about this. She did know that she wanted to speak to him before the solicitor was called, before the documents were produced and the legal machinery began, and everything became formal and measured in the language of property and provision, rather than the language of a woman who had stood in front of her dead mother's portrait and felt the floor of herself tilt. She went to the library. He was there. He usually was at this hour. A man who preferred books to morning calls and had arranged his life as far as it was arrangeable to reflect this preference. He was at the reading table near the window, papers spread before him, a cup of coffee cooling at his elbow.
He looked up when she entered. He did not look surprised. She said, "You know." He said, "I have known since the morning you arrived." He said it directly, without apology, without the careful softening that people usually applied to things they felt guilty about. I was 11 years old when my grandmother sent your mother away. I remember it. I was not consulted, and I would not have agreed for whatever an 11-year-old's disagreement is worth." He paused. "When Mrs. Aldridge told me she had found you, I asked her to let you find it yourself. I did not want to be the person who told you. I did not think I had earned that." She said, "You let me clean your house for 2 years." He said, "Yes." His voice was even. "That is the part I am least able to justify. I told myself I was waiting for the right moment. I told myself I was protecting you from a disruption you had not asked for." He looked at her steadily. "The truth is that I did not know how to begin, and I chose silence when I should have chosen honesty. That was wrong, and I am not going to excuse it." The room was quiet. Morning light came through the tall windows at the angle it always came, falling across the books and the papers and the man sitting very still, waiting for whatever she decided. She said, "My grandmother commissioned a portrait of my mother." He said, "Yes." She said, "She hid a letter behind it." He said, "I know. I found it when I was 19. I left it where it was because it was not mine to read or to move." She said, "She called her my Clara, always mine." He said, "She never stopped, in all the years after." He paused. "She was not a woman who said things she did not mean." Lord Aldous Vane arrived at Dunmore Hall 4 days later. He was the Duke's second cousin, the son of the 4th Duke's younger brother, and he had been, in the absence of any confirmed direct heir, the most likely beneficiary of a significant portion of the Dunmore estate's secondary holdings. He was 41, dressed in the kind of clothes that communicated wealth without taste, and he moved through the entrance hall of Dunmore Hall with the proprietary ease of a man who had been privately calculating what he would do with a house before he was certain he would have it. He had been informed by his solicitor that a claim had been filed against the estate's secondary provision. He had come to resolve it. He found Sarah in the portrait gallery. She had been spending time there, learning the faces of a family that was and was not hers, making herself know the history she had been kept from. She was standing before the 4th Duke's portrait when Lord Aldous walked in with his solicitor behind him, and the expression of a man who had decided, before he arrived, exactly how this scene would go. He said, "You are the girl." She said, "I am Sarah Vane, yes." He looked at her with the particular assessment of a man looking at an obstacle rather than a person. He said, "My solicitor has reviewed the provision, and he believes there are significant questions about the legitimacy of the claim." She said, "Your solicitor may take his questions to Mr. Hartwell, who has reviewed the same provision and found it entirely unambiguous." She paused. "He has also reviewed the birth records, the letter from the Dowager Duchess, the portrait commission records, and the locket, which carries the Vane family crest and matches the registry of personal items belonging to Clara Vane, recorded in the household inventory of 1847. Lord Aldous stared at her. She said, "I am not a question, Lord Aldous. I am an answer that took 23 years to arrive." He said, "You are a housemaid who found a painting." She said, "I am the granddaughter of the 3rd Duke of Dunmore and the daughter of Clara Vane, who was sent from this house with a new name and a requirement of silence because your family was more afraid of their reputation than of what they were doing to her." She did not raise her voice. She had her mother's way of looking at things directly, and she used it now, fully, without flinching. "I cleaned this house for 2 years. I polished silver that belonged to my grandmother. I laid fires in rooms my mother played in as a child. I did all of this without knowing, which means I did it without any design or intention or scheme that you could use against me even if you wanted to." She said, "I suggest you allow your solicitor to speak to Mr. Hartwell, and I suggest you do not waste any more of anyone's time suggesting that a woman's legitimacy can be dissolved by the inconvenience it causes someone else." Lord Aldous' solicitor had not written anything in his notebook since Sarah began speaking. He was looking at her with an expression that was professionally neutral and privately something considerably closer to admiration.
Lord Aldous said, "This is not finished." The Duke's voice came from the doorway. He said, "Actually, it is." His voice was the voice he used for things that were decided rather than things that were being decided. Low, even, entirely without heat. Sarah's claim has been reviewed by 2 independent solicitors and by the estate's own legal counsel. It is legitimate, documented, and uncontestable. The provision stands. The transfer of the secondary estate will proceed. He crossed the room and stood beside Sarah, not in front of her, not between her and Lord Aldous, but beside her, as an equal stands beside an equal. He said, "I would also ask you to remember, Aldous, that whatever you intend to say about this in the county, Mr. Hartwell has prepared a full and accurate account of the circumstances of Clara Vane's removal from this house, which he is prepared to share with anyone who expresses curiosity about the legitimacy of Sarah's claim." He paused. "The Vane family's handling of the matter 23 years ago does not reflect well on us. I would rather it did not become public, but I will not protect it at Sarah's expense. I will not make that choice again." Lord Aldous looked between them. He looked at Sarah for a long moment, at the amber eyes and the direct gaze and the locket at her throat that he likely recognized, if he had ever paid attention to family inventory, as the one his great-aunt had worn every day for 60 years. He left without speaking again. His solicitor followed, and Sarah noticed as he passed that his notebook was open to a page that remained entirely blank. The county gathering was Lady Fenwick's spring dinner. It was the first social event of the season, attended by every family of standing in the county, hosted in the Fenwick drawing-room under 3 chandeliers and the watchful eyes of 4 generations of Fenwick ancestors whose portraits had been arranged along the staircase in ascending order of self-satisfaction. Sarah attended. She had not planned to. She had spent the weeks since Lord Aldous' visit at Dunmore Hall, learning the estate with the focused, methodical attention she had brought to every task she had ever been given, except that now the task was hers, and the estate was hers, and the methodical attention felt less like the discipline of a woman making herself useful, and more like the particular pleasure of a woman finally being allowed to understand what she was standing on. But Mrs. Aldridge had come to her door on a Thursday morning and said, simply, "Lady Fenwick has invited you. I think you should go." Sarah said, "Why?" Mrs. Aldridge had said, "Because Lord Aldous will be there, and because the county has heard 3 versions of this story already, and none of them are accurate, and because the only person who can establish the accurate version before it calcifies into something you will spend years correcting is you." She had worn her mother's locket. The Duke arrived at the Fenwick drawing-room before her, and was standing near the fireplace when she was announced. She saw him see her, and she saw the moment he registered the locket, and something in his expression did the thing it had begun to do in recent weeks, a loosening, almost imperceptible, of the careful distance he maintained. Lady Fenwick received her with the particular warmth of a woman who had already decided that this was the most interesting thing to happen in the county in years, and intended to be remembered as having been gracious about it from the beginning. Lord Aldous was across the room. He looked at Sarah when she entered, and then looked away, which told her everything she needed to know about the version of the story he had been sharing. Mrs. Thorne, the wife of the county's largest landowner, came to Sarah within 10 minutes. She said, "My dear, what a remarkable thing. We have heard so many accounts." She paused with the bright, expectant smile of a woman who wanted the definitive version from the primary source so she could disseminate it with authority. Sarah said, "I imagine you have. The true account is straightforward. My mother was Clara Vane, daughter of the 3rd Duke of Dunmore. She was sent from this family 23 years ago for reasons that reflected the prejudices of the time rather than any failing of her own. She raised me alone, and she died when I was 15, and she never told me where she came from because she was required to be silent about it." She paused. She said, "I came to Dunmore Hall 2 years ago as a housemaid. I cleaned the house I was born to inherit. I did this without knowing it, which is the only remarkable part of the story. The rest is simply what happens when families make wrong choices and the truth waits long enough to correct them."
Mrs. Thorne had no practiced response for this, because she had not expected it to be said so plainly. Lord Aldous, who had moved closer during Sarah's account, said from slightly behind Mrs. Thorne, "The claim has been accepted, though I understand there were considerable questions about the documentation." Sarah turned to look at him. She said, "The documentation is complete and has been confirmed by 3 independent solicitors. If you have a specific question about any element of it, I am happy to direct you to Mr. Hartwell, who prepared the full record." She paused. "If you are suggesting, without a specific question, that there is something uncertain about my identity, I would ask you to consider that I am wearing my grandmother's locket, that I have my mother's face, and that the Dowager Duchess of Dunmore spent 20 years looking for me and left a handwritten letter describing exactly who I am and why she was looking." She looked at him steadily. She said, "I am not a rumor, Lord Aldous. I am a fact." The Duke had crossed the room. He stood beside her. He did not say anything immediately. He simply stood there, with the absolute settled authority of a man who had made his position clear and had nothing to add to it. Lord Aldous said nothing. Mr. Thorne, who had come to find his wife and had arrived in time to hear the last exchange, said quietly but audibly, "Good Lord, she has the Dowager's eyes." He said it the way people say the thing they did not mean to say aloud, with the genuine, unmanaged surprise of recognition. Several people turned to look, then looked at the portrait of the Dowager Duchess of Dunmore. Lady Fenwick had been the Dowager's closest friend and had kept the portrait as a tribute, and looked back at Sarah. Lord Aldous picked up his glass and walked away. He did not speak to Sarah that evening. She went to the portrait the morning after the dinner. Not the Dowager's portrait, her mother's. She went alone in the early morning before the house woke, and she stood in the east wing sitting room with the light just beginning to come through the uncurtained window, and she looked at Clara Voss, Clara Vane, laughing in a garden 24 years ago, before anyone had told her what her laugh was going to cost her. She said out loud to the painted face of the woman who raised her on silence and pressed violets and an unfinished letter addressed to no one, "I found it. Whatever you meant to tell me, I found it." The house was quiet around her. 300 acres of Wiltshire morning, entirely still. She heard a footstep in the corridor. She did not turn. The Duke said from the doorway, "I thought you might be here." She said, "She was 20 when this was painted. I never knew her at 20. He said, "She looked like you, or you looked like her." He came to stand beside her, not close, simply present the way he had been present in recent weeks, a steady and unhurried thing that she had stopped trying to categorize and had simply begun to accept. She had your way of not quite composing herself for the painter. She said, "She kept this hidden for 20 years, my grandmother. She commissioned it and hid it in a wing no one used and left a letter behind it for someone who might not have found it for another 20 years. She paused. She must have been very lonely."
He said, "She was." He said it quietly. "She talked about your mother every day, not to people who could not understand, but to Mrs. Aldrich and to me when I was old enough to listen." He paused. "She called her my Clara, always, even at the end. It was how she began every sentence about her." Sarah turned to look at him. She said, "And you have been here this whole time, 2 years of watching me clean rooms I should have been owning." He said, "Yes, and I am sorry for it, without qualification or excuse." He met her eyes. "I cannot undo the 2 years. I cannot undo what was done to your mother. I can tell you that I intend to spend however much time you will allow me, making certain that nothing in this house is ever again more interested in its own comfort than in the truth." She looked at him for a long time. She said, "That is a considerable commitment for a man who is technically my second cousin." He said, "The family tree of the Vane family has historically accommodated considerable complexity." He said it with the particular dry precision of a man who had decided if he was going to feel something, he was going to be honest.
About it, rather than careful. I do not intend to let complexity be an excuse for doing nothing. She said, "What do you intend instead?" He said, "Whatever you will allow." She looked at the portrait of her mother. Her mother laughed above her, caught in the moment before composure, permanent and alive. She said, "My grandmother said, 'Take what is yours without apology.'" He said, "She was right." She said, "I think I am beginning to understand that." She turned back to the painting. The morning light had reached it now, warming the pale dress and the rose-climbing wall and her mother's face into something that looked almost like the garden outside the window, real and present and growing. He stayed beside her until the house woke up around them. Neither of them had any particular reason to move. The transfer of the secondary estate was completed in the spring. Sarah took up residence not at a separate property, but at Dunmore Hall itself by mutual agreement, occupying the rooms in the east wing that had been closed since her grandmother's death and that she spent the first month opening, pulling back curtains that had not been opened in years, letting the Wiltshire light into rooms that had been dim since before she was born. She moved her mother's portrait to the main gallery. She had a proper frame made for it, not elaborate, not a statement, simply a frame that said, "This painting belongs here, in this room, among these faces, as it always should have." The Dowager Duchess's portrait had hung there already, and Sarah placed her mother's beside it, so that grandmother and daughter, who had spent 20 years apart and never in life managed to find their way back to each other, were finally in the same room. She stood in front of them the morning the second portrait went up, the house quiet around her, the early light coming through the east windows. Mrs. Aldrich came to stand beside her. She said, after a long moment, she would have been glad. Sarah said, yes, she said she would. They stood together for a while. The gallery was quiet. The two portraits looked back at them with the particular patience of people who have waited a long time for something and have finally been given it. The Duke came in at 8:30, as he often did now, with no particular announcement and no particular ceremony, which was how Sarah had decided she preferred things, present rather than performed. He looked at the two portraits side by side. He said, "It is right." She said, "Yes, it is." He stood beside her. The morning went around them. Sarah Voss had spent 23 years not knowing where she came from. She had spent 2 of those years cleaning the floors of the house that carried her name, polishing the silver her grandmother had touched, laying fires in the rooms her mother had run through as a child. She had done it without knowing, without scheming, without any design beyond the ordinary human need to work and to eat and to make herself useful in whatever room she found herself in. And then a pipe had frozen,
and a door had swung open, and at the end of a corridor, in a room no one had entered in years, a young woman had been laughing in a garden, caught in oil and pigment 24 years ago by an artist who had been asked to make her permanent. My Clara, always mine. Some things are worth waiting for. Some truths find their way home eventually through frozen pipes and swung open doors and letters hidden behind paintings in wings no one is supposed to enter. Sarah Vane had come to Dunmore Hall with a single trunk and a locket she did not understand. She had polished his silver every morning. She had not known until she did that the silver was hers too. If this story moved you, if it stayed with you, subscribe to the Duke Obsession right now. Every single week, we bring you a story built exactly like this one. Hidden rooms, forgotten daughters, portraits that hold secrets, and the moment a woman finds out that the house she has been cleaning was always hers. Turn on notifications so you never miss the reveal. And tell us in the comments, what was the moment you knew? We read every single one. Until next time, remember, some doors do not open until you are ready to walk through them.